Let's dive right into this. I want you to imagine a biological operating system that was so universally accepted, so undeniably trusted, that it literally ruled human understanding for millennia. Today, in this explainer, we're unpacking one of the most fascinating, complex, and, spoiler alert, entirely incorrect medical frameworks in human history. We're talking about the theory of the four humors. And listen, this wasn't just some fringe crackpot idea. For centuries, this was the absolute, unquestioned science of human biology.
Now, to really wrap our heads around just how completely this system dominated, we've got to ask a pretty visceral question. Why on earth did highly educated elite physicians rely on seemingly bizarre methods, like actually tasting a patient's urine or intentionally draining pints of their blood? I mean, it sounds like pure madness to us today, right? But as we're going to see, within their specific framework, it made absolute, perfect, logical sense.
And we really need to emphasize the sheer scale of this era. 2,000 years. Let that sink in. From the ancient Greeks all the way up to the mid-19th century, the four humors were not just a passing fad. They were the undeniable truth. I mean, even Oxford and Cambridge medical graduates in the 1700s were still using this exact same system as their very first-line treatment. So, where did this massive, enduring idea actually come from?
Well, it actually started with a monumental leap forward in human thought. Back in the late 5th or early 4th century BCE, a Hippocratic treatise called On the Nature of Man was published. And before this came along, if you got sick, people just assumed the gods were angry with you. It was divine wrath, plain and simple. But this text introduced a revolutionary shift toward rational medicine. It insisted that diseases had natural, observable causes. Basically, it replaced angry gods with invisible fluids.
So the crucial point here is the foundational logic of this entire system. It basically boils down to two Greek concepts. First, you have eucrasia, which means perfectly mixed fluids. When you have this, boom, you're healthy. Then there's dyscrasia, which means an imbalance of these fluids. And when you have that, you're sick. It's really that simple. Disease wasn't an outside invader like a virus. It was literally just a mechanical imbalance of your body's internal liquids.
And this brilliantly illustrates how perfectly everything aligns in this beautiful symmetrical matrix. You've got the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and each one is tied directly to a classical element, a season, and physical qualities. So blood is hot and moist, just like the air in spring. Black bile is cold and dry, like the earth in autumn. To the ancient mind, this made perfect, elegant sense. It explained exactly why certain illnesses spiked during specific times of the year. Section 1. The Original Personality Test. Now, this system didn't just stop at physical medicine. Thanks to a 2nd century physician named Galen of Pergamon, who is basically the most influential doctor after Hippocrates, these fluids became the very first psychological framework. The ideal was a perfectly balanced human being, with completely equal amounts of each fluid. But according to Galen, almost no one actually stayed perfectly balanced like that. We all have a dominant fluid. It's a unique temperament that tips the scales, creating very specific physiological and emotional extremes that make us who we are.
So ancient doctors categorized everyone into these four fluid-based buckets. If you had an excess of blood, you were sanguine. Cheerful and energetic, but maybe prone to fevers. Excess phlegm made you phlegmatic. Super calm, but maybe a bit sluggish. Got too much yellow bile? You were choleric, ambitious, quick-tempered, and lean. And an overabundance of black bile made you melancholic, deeply thoughtful and artistic, but highly prone to dark, brooding depressions.
What's truly fascinating, and frankly a bit wild to think about today, is how this theory was actively used to explain and even justify society and gender differences. According to humoral theory, women were considered naturally colder and moister than men, meaning they were inherently more phlegmatic. And in the minds of ancient physicians, this perfectly explained why women were supposedly more prone to emotional instability. The science literally bent to fit the culture of the time.
Section 2. Extreme Medicine, Correcting the Imbalance.
Okay, so if your whole life is dictated by these fluids going out of whack, what actually happens when you go to the doctor? Well, the doctor's entire job was to manually force your body back into equilibrium. And diagnosing that imbalance, it was an intensely physical, deeply visceral process. A medieval doctor wouldn't just take your pulse, they had to inspect your bodily excretions. Black, thick urine signaled an excess of black bile. Pale, watery urine meant way too much phlegm. And yeah, confirming the diagnosis sometimes literally meant the physician tasting the sediment of your urine just to check the qualities. Yikes.
But once they had a diagnosis, the treatment was remarkably straightforward. It was all about the principle of contraries. You treat opposites with opposites. So let's say you had a hot and dry fever, meaning too much yellow bile. The doctor wouldn't give you warning spices. No way. They would prescribe cold and wet remedies, like cucumbers or barley water. If you had a cold and wet illness, you'd get hot and dry pepper or ginger. It's actually a very satisfying aha moment when you realize the incredibly rigid logic behind it.
But of course, a simple diet change wasn't always enough. When things got serious, doctors turned to the absolute superstar therapy of the era, venesection. You probably know it better as bloodletting. Galen had emphasized that blood was the most prevalent tumor, so to drain in excess and restore that precious balance, physicians would literally slice open a vein in the arm, the foot, or even the forehead, sometimes draining pints of blood at a single time.
And Galen absolutely loved bloodletting. He would even perform these dramatic public bleedings. There's this one story where he bragged about removing so much blood from a patient that a rival physician watching the whole thing sarcastically joked that the poor man would need to be refilled like an empty wineskin. It's a little dark humor from history, but it really highlights just how aggressive and genuinely terrifying this healing process could be.
Now, if bleeding wasn't your doctor's preferred method, don't worry, there were plenty of other chaotic interventions. They used severe purging with laxatives like rhubarb and senna to literally flush out black bile. They used heated glass cups to draw fluids right up to the surface of the skin. And amazingly, they timed all of this using astrology. Medieval and Renaissance doctors would actually consult zodiac charts to find the absolute safest planetary hour to bleed you. It was a perfect blend of medicine and the movement of the stars.
Section 3. The long tail of a myth.
Let's move to this and see how this builds over time, because you really have to wonder, how did a system based entirely on invisible, non-existent fluids survive across multiple continents and drastically different eras of human history? Looking across this timeline, we start with Hippocrates in Greece, then Galen in Rome. Fast forward to 1025 CE, and the brilliant Islamic scholar Avicenna preserves and refines the whole theory in his canon of medicine. It becomes the standard curriculum in European universities. It survives the Renaissance with Vesalius and holds on tight all the way to 18th century British doctors. It was, quite literally, a globally inherited truth.
And the sheer survival of this myth creates some incredible historical paradoxes. Take Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century, for example. This guy completely revolutionized human anatomy by meticulously dissecting cadavers. He was looking directly inside the human body. He saw exactly how muscles and veins worked with his own two eyes. But he never saw black bile. Yet, despite this groundbreaking physical evidence, the myth was so deeply entrenched that he just continued to faithfully teach humoral theory anyway.
It wasn't until the mid-19th century that modern science finally dismantled the four humors, proving once and for all that these circulating fluids simply do not exist. But here's the thing, their legacy is permanent. When we call someone sanguine about a difficult situation, or say a friend has a melancholy vibe, we are directly referencing Galen's bodily fluids. From Shakespeare's brooding characters right down to the everyday vocabulary we use right now, the ghost of this massive medical myth is still deeply embedded in our culture.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating takeaway to wrap up this explainer. For 2 millennia, brilliant minds were absolutely certain that tapping a vein or tasting urine was the absolute peak of medical science.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
What absolute, undeniable medical truths that we fiercely believe today will look like bizarre, primitive myths to the focused learners sitting in our place 2,000 years from now?